Hey folks, Colin here from Something's Recording, and today I'm going to show you my approach to sample replacement on drums. We're going to be talking about sample replacement on snare drum today, but before we dive in, if you're ready to learn what it takes to get a great snare recording so you don't have to sample replace your snare drum, then I have just the tool for you. It is my essential guide to recording snare drum. It's a simple PDF that will walk you everything you need to know in the snare recording process, from mic choice to mic placement to setting your input gain to get you a polished and professional sounding snare recording without any more hassle. It's completely free, and you can download the guide below using the link in the video description. Now let's jump in here and take a look at this snare drum. Now I usually try my best to not add samples on drums. I have always been a proponent of leaving live drums live. So live kick, live snare, live toms. The only thing I usually do is I edit out the bleed from the toms so we don't have any kind of phase issues with rides and cymbals coming through in different places on the pan toms. That's usually the only editing I do to my drums. I leave the kick and I leave the snare as live as possible because I believe that's where you get the vibe and that's where you get the character and personality of the player. And the personality of the player is what makes the performance and makes the track. The best tone you're going to get is from a great performer. Now in this case, the performer was doing everything they can to make this track sound great. Great performance, great character, great playing. Unfortunately, the recording process here wasn't as great as it probably could have been. Let me play you the drums as they're sounding at the moment. This is with the sample replace snare in, and then I'm going to show you the original snare and why I ended up sample replacing it. Then I'll walk you through that process of how I did it. Those are the raw recorded drums. No mixing done on that yet. Just a little bit of limiting to keep everything in place so it's easier to level balance the drums when we do get to the mixing process. Let me pull up the original snare drum here. So here is our original snare drum. We'll pull it up to about the level that our current snare samples at. Take a listen to our original snare drum here. Now to me, it felt like the mic was a little bit shoddy. There are a couple places at the beginning where the snare actually cuts out. You can see right here, it actually cuts out as well as here. So the mic just completely dies in these places. But at the end here, it kind of gives me the feeling there's something wrong with the mic because the low end comes and goes on the snare drum recording. So at some points we have a little bit low end, a little bit more volume, and then at some points you can kind of feel the volume drop and the low end dissipates. So either the mic was out of phase during the recording, or there was just something wrong with the microphone. Like I said, it does cut out at some points. So in this instance, there wasn't a lot I could do to save this snare recording, especially with the amount of bleed we have coming from the hi-hat. It's essentially a hi-hat mic here. So what I did was I replaced it with a sample of itself. So I went here to the beginning to find a good snare drum to start with. And you can kind of see these match pretty well because that's actually the snare hit I used. So instead of bringing in an alternative drum or an alternative sound to put underneath this, I like to build samples from the original kit so it sounds as natural and as live as possible because it is the drum that the player was hitting in the room under those overhead mics, under that snare mic. So the sounds are still going to be similar. They're still going to mesh together well. We won't have any phase issues or any kind of tonal issues like that. So I'm going to disable the sample added in for the moment. We'll hide it, and I'm going to show you how I created this sample. So what we're going to do first here is I'm going to duplicate this snare track. So now we have snare 3. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this section of the snare drum and copy it down to this track here. So now I have an exact copy of this snare hit here on a new track. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn this into our sample. So let's edit this down until it's a nice single snare hit by itself here. Now, if you don't know there, I'm just using the tab to transient feature, so I can come right up to the snare, hit tab, and it will tab right to the initial transient of the snare, and then I can Alt-X to cut at that transient and get rid of everything before. That way, when I paste this in, I can paste it right at the transient of each snare, so everything will line up phase-wise. And I always do like to add a little bit of a fade, though, just so we have no clicks or pops or anything. And then I'm going to zoom in as much as possible to see kind of where everything comes in. Let's go about here to start and see where we end up. And I like to fade back as much as possible. Let's take a listen to how this sounds here. So a little bit of bleed on the back end there still. So let's go a little bit further, and then we'll make it a little bit stronger on the fade. So we can see there's our bleed. What if we come down to there? Pull our fade as far in as we can go. And then what we'll do is we'll make the back end of the fade exponential, so it's a little bit heavier, a little bit quicker of a fade out. That sounded good to me, or as good as it can sound for the way this drum was recorded. Now, what I do as I paste this in is I grab fills and stuff from the original drum. That way the fills don't have any kind of weird like shotgun sound to them, right? Or machine gun sound, like it's a pasted in sample rolling through the fill, the da-da-da-da-da-da, everything's at the same volume, right? And I don't want to program in stuff, right? I don't want to paste transients down to MIDI and then have to deal with leveling out the MIDI to make it sound more natural. So instead, I just grab the fills from the original drum. So what we can do is we can bounce down this sample here. So I'm going to turn off Snap to Grid and the bounce features so it'll just bounce in place. And now we have our nice little sample that we can paste in throughout our kit. So I'm going to copy this guy here and then delete it. And what I do here is I go to the original snare drum, solo it up, and I'm going to skip this fill here. We'll talk about that in a second. I do like to put the follow on so as I move along it follows. Oop, zoomed in a little bit too much. Just go before the first snare hit, tab to transient there, and then click down to your next track, paste your sample, back up, next to the snare hit, down, paste, so back up, tab to your next snare transient, click down to the next track, paste in your sample, back up, tab to the next transient, down, paste in the sample, and so forth and so on. So I just go through the track like this, pasting in the sample. See, I missed one there. So if you get in too much of a groove, it's easy to miss one. But I just go through the track like this, pasting in samples, and then if I get to a fill, I skip it for the moment, and I usually stop at one of the transients, put in a marker, and keep going. So all we're doing in here, pasting in our sample at our snare hits. So once you get in the groove of it, you can kind of move pretty fast here, pasting in your samples. And you want to make sure if you see little blobs like this, you want to make sure pause and make sure it's not a snare roll or something. So it's not, that's just our hi-hat opening and closing. Let's get to at least this first big fill here. So we'll go a little bit further into the song and we'll take a look at this fill. So say we're going along, right? Pasting in our samples here. Now ghosts, you can see the little ghosts here sometimes. I usually leave those out. You could put those in if you want and just decrease the volume of your sample. It'll give you a little bit of that kind of ghost vibe, but I like to get it from the overheads. So I paste in the snare sample so there's no bleed, and then I can pull up the overheads farther, and I'll get that ghosting effect from the actual overheads here. So let's take a look at this fill. So instead of trying to go in and paste samples all the way through this fill, and then, like I said, having that shotgun effect, what I do is turn back on my snap to grid here. I'm just going to copy this section of the fill, go a little bit before and a little bit after, copy it down to this track, if I can copy it down. There we go. And then I'll solo up this track here and edit it just so it's just the fill, and then we move on to our next piece. That's how I'm going to put the fills in, okay? Instead of, like I said, pasting through the fill and then trying to edit your volumes and stuff to try and get it to sound more natural, I literally just pull in the actual fill. It keeps some of the personality and some of the vibe from the performer in the track. We are pasting samples through, but we're trying to paste them on our single hits. Fills, ghosts, and stuff like that, I try to pull from the original track as much as possible. So like this fill here, I would do the same thing. Just copy the section, pull it down, and then same thing here. The only goal here is to reduce as much of the cymbal bleed as possible. Tom bleed is okay because your snare and tom rolls can kind of bleed into each other like that. It does help to keep it more natural, especially pulling down the fill like this. But I just like to put fades on each side so our cymbal bleed doesn't sound too crazy cutting in and out from a sample like that. That's how I'm pasting in the sample, okay? Then you can get rid of your original snare drum, or you can mix them together. And what I mean by that is we can solo up our original snare drum, pull it down, solo up our sample, and then mix them together here. This way, if you're not getting enough of that ghosting sound from your overhead mic, or if you're at a room mic as well, obviously there's no room mic here, if you're not getting enough of that ghosting, you can pull in the original snare drum underneath your sampled snare. And if you're still not getting enough and you don't want to pull it up far enough, right, because you're still getting too much of that bleed there, what you can do is you can side chain it to your sample. So when your sample's happening, you're not hearing your original snare, and then you can let the ghosting come up in between your snare samples and kind of balance between them. So just a couple ideas here on adding in samples to keep the drums as natural and as live sounding as possible, because we want to keep and we want to save the performance and the personality of our drummer, of our player, because that is what makes the song, that is what makes the track. I hope that was helpful for you. Like I said, if you're ready to take your snare recordings to the next level and you want to avoid the trouble of having to paste in samples or program MIDI samples in, then I have just the tool for you, and it is completely free. It is my essential guide to recording snare drum, and you can download it using the link in the video description to start creating more professional recordings in less time. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.